Thank you. Amanda is a professor in the departments of Communication Studies and Screen Arts and Cultures at the University of Michigan. Her research focuses on US television, specifically the industrial shifts since the end of the network era, and on representations of gender on television and in the media. Amanda is the recipient of many awards for her work on television. She serves on the editorial boards of a number of key media and communication journals, including, fittingly, the Journal of Media Industries, and she is the incoming chair of the Media Industries Interest Group of ICA. Amanda, as you've probably gathered if you've read her bio, is a prolific writer and is the author, co-author and editor of many important books. She's the author of Cable Guys, Television and American Masculinities in the 21st Century, 2014. The Television Will Be Revolutionised, revised in 2014, and Redesigning Women Television After the Network Era, 2006. She's the co-author with Timothy Havens of Understanding Media Industries and with Jonathan Gray of Television Studies. Amanda is also editor of Beyond Primetime Television Programming in the Post-Network Era. Of these many titles, The Television Will Be Revolutionised is a book that I'm imagining many here will be familiar with. In one review of this book, it's praised as a book that is extraordinary in its scope, depth and readability, and described as required reading for those seeking to understand the complexity and shifting dynamics of contemporary media culture. Her current work examines how cable changed television and became the dominant supplier of internet access, work which I understand informs her keynote today. And she's currently working on a book in progress, if I've remembered the title correctly, the working title, Cable Revolutions. And Amanda will be drawing from this in her keynote. So it's my very great pleasure to welcome Professor Lotz to Australia and to ANZCA, and please make her feel welcome.
Thank you. I'm very pleased and honored to be here. The talk is from the new book, which is in progress. The new project in some ways takes off where The Television Will Be Revolutionized leaves off, or treads similar territory but tells the story in a different way. Chronologically, from 1996 through 2016, digging into the story of how it is and why it is that US television changed, and then the story there is cable, and then the internet came to disrupt it all, perhaps revolutionize. I haven't decided yet. All right. I completed my undergraduate degree 20 years ago this past May. Though most of my college memories do not involve television, many of them do. I distinctly remember coming into my dormitory during the first week of classes and finding many of my fellow first-year students gathered around the large set. It looked something like that. Watching the MTV Video Awards. It was a spontaneous co-viewing experience, and I remember thinking, college is going to be great. During subsequent years, I recall returning to the dorm on Monday nights to find a flock of women watching Beverly Hills 90210, then Melrose Place, of walking through the student building at lunch one day and seeing everyone transfixed by sets that announced the acquittal of O.J. Simpson, or of Thursday nights out that couldn't begin until Friends, Seinfeld, and sometimes ER were over. With the exception of the MTV Awards, all those still remarkably vivid memories were of experiences of broadcast television. The experiences of a student graduating today, recalling the role of television in her life over the last 4 years, would be vastly different. I suspect much more personalized. But the sources of that programming, too, would be much different. It is rare to find a show a classroom of students now share in common, but most would be united by Real Housewives of someplace, The Walking Dead, maybe Game of Thrones. Notably, all of those series were created for cable channels. Now, because I am far from home, allow me to quickly clarify broadcast networks and cable channels, because I know the classifications of origin are lost as soon as these series leave the US. Broadcast networks, in theory, distribute their messages by terrestrial broadcast signal, though most, 85% of US homes, have received them as part of packages delivered by cable or satellite providers for the last couple decades. Historically, like when I was in college, broadcasters' only source of revenue was advertisements, while cable channels' revenue derived roughly equally from advertising and fees paid by the services to include the channel on their service. So where I live, Comcast is the service provider that brings me cable. And so I pay Comcast a monthly bill, and Comcast pays all the channels that it carries some little bit for making their service available. The reason I have made a big production about all my defining television moments coming from broadcasters is because 20 years ago, the most watched shows on cable were Nickelodeon's children's programming and World Wrestling. Cable was, by and large, a programming backwater. Its programs the butt of jokes. An extraordinary transition took place throughout the first decade of the 21st century, one that might not have been clear outside the US. Cable became the source not only of programming people didn't make fun of, but of the most renowned creative excellence. If you've seen or heard of The Sopranos, Mad Men, or Breaking Bad, all of these are important chapters in this story. My talk today explores how and why scripted US television series evolved so profoundly at the dawn of the 21st century. The talk draws from research that set out to uncover the story behind the profound change in US television over the last 20 years, particularly the part of the story that has been overshadowed by the later emergence of internet-distributed television. The talk explains why and how US television changed, probes the industrial practices that propelled and challenged that change, and examines how the conditions of creative workers evolved in the process. Before I get started, though, let me explain why you might care. I don't want to submerge a talk that's off to a fine start in the intricate nuances of specialty subfield debates, so allow me to set up some assumptions that could be debated for a few days if this were a US TV Studies conference, but I ask you to grant them as generally true. The series produced for cable channels in the first decade of the 21st century are among the most creatively excellent storytelling ever produced by the US television industry. Not always the most watched or profitable, these series were distinctive, a term that was rarely applied to US television, and mostly to describe series that would quickly be canceled. Although I am telling the story of a particular place, a particular time, and a particular medium, it is simultaneously the story of a widespread change in the creativity and storytelling norms of a commercial medium. And it is a story of pronounced change that occurs within a relatively short span of just a decade. So the lens through which I'd suggest this talk may be broadly interesting is as a case study of a profound event for a media industry that might serve as the prompt for thought experiments about how its lessons may and may not be relevant in other places, times, and media. To begin at the beginning, then, why did US television change? The most basic explanation is that there was a shift in the competitive environment. Two important developments occurred in 1996 that altered the playing field. First, the US Congress passed the Telecommunications Act of 1996, a wide-ranging piece of legislation that in many ways was the most substantial and encompassing rulemaking for US television since the groundwork established for radio in 1934. The relevant bit of the Telecom Act was a provision that allowed cable providers and phone providers to begin competing with each other. At the time the law was crafted, cable providers were mostly monopoly services that consistently raised prices at a rate many times that of inflation. Without a competitive marketplace, citizens turned to legislators who enacted some stopgap rate regulations, but mostly wanted nothing to do with such micromanagement. So the hope was the legislation would spur competition. Curiously, competition did emerge, but not because of the Telecom Act. The second development of 1996 was the fruition of satellite distribution of video that would compete with cable. At the end of 1995, 61% of US homes paid for cable, yet a mere 7% for satellite, and this was still largely the large C-band satellites. Satellite service of the 18-inch DBS type had just begun a few years earlier, but was becoming established by 1996. Moreover, satellite wasn't just drawing customers from rural areas where cable had never been available, but drew subscribers away from cable. The combined current threat from satellite and the perceived coming threat from telephone providers allowed by the 1996 Act spurred the cable service industry to the overdue task of rebuilding its infrastructure and transitioning from analog systems that had a capacity of about 30 channels to digital systems that had the potential for hundreds of channels. A reminder that cable programming in this era was far from what we know today. For example, in the summer of 1997, we see that by far the most watched programs were that of kids' channel Nickelodeon. Wrestling often rated highly, but even the well-known sports channel, ESPN, had limited licenses for top sport programming at this time. In this era of analog cable systems, channels were able to make a successful business simply by providing an alternative to the big three, then four, broadcast networks. Most cable channels offered daily schedules of programs filled with shows that had originally been developed for and aired by broadcast networks. This was an adequate competitive strategy in an era of 30 channels. But many recognized new strategies would be needed for competition among hundreds of channels. Standing out in the competitive coming environment required that channels develop original programming, which was valuable in two ways. First, half of the revenue of cable channels came from the cable service providers that paid a monthly per household fee, a fee that was paid simply if the home received the channel, regardless of whether the channel was watched at all. These fees are renegotiated every few years. Cable channels recognized that they would have a better bargaining position if they offered viewers content unavailable elsewhere. Secondly, original programming would be helpful in establishing a channel identity that would allow the channel to stand out to viewers, what comes to be called branding. Although several channels had attempted to stake some kind of identity, most clearly Nickelodeon for kids or ESPN for sports, because programming for many other channels was mostly derived from broadcasters' former offerings, most of the programming carried the association of the original broadcast license holder and was designed for a broader audience than the cable brand intended. It is this changing competitive landscape that leads to the production of the first successful original scripted cable series. To many memories, The Sopranos was the first such series. In fact, it was not. But before going further, I need to make clear a key distinction, that between advertising and subscriber-supported cable channels. HBO, Showtime, and Starz are purely subscriber-funded. They have no advertising. This makes them very different businesses. They are not directly concerned with how many people watch any given program, but measure success in how many new people subscribe to the service and how many subscribers stop the service. Their central goal is to provide as many subscribers as possible with enough programming that the subscribers find it worthwhile to maintain the subscription. Ad-supported cable is funded by both advertising and those fees cable providers pay. In the 1990s context, the revenue split was about 50-50, but fun fact, for many channels, subscriber fees are now a much greater share, really to an extent that they'd be more precisely identified as advertising subsidized and subscriber supported, but I digress. The advertising versus subscriber supported distinction and the consequences it had for the strategy of cable channels are important for understanding their efforts to develop original series. Advertising supported channels, and here I'm going to tell the story of USA, were motivated to develop original series to stand out from the vast number of competitors and in hopes of attracting more viewers, particularly the ones that advertisers wanted to reach. Subscriber-supported channels, and here I'll emphasize HBO, were motivated for different reasons that I'll get to later. So, what prevented cable channels from developing original scripted series? Why didn't they emerge earlier? The answer is an inextricable mix of cost, risk, and marketing. Original scripted series cost much more than buying old series, and series development is also quite risky. Cable programming budgets were much smaller than broadcasters, so creating an original series was a putting all your eggs in one basket scenario. And the odds for success were 10 to 20%, even at a broadcast network that had been developing series for decades. Moreover, it was particularly daunting to be the first. Remember that in this context, viewers did not habitually check what was on cable channels, expecting to see a new program. Success in this endeavor would require significant reacculturation of the audience. Even more challenging, cable channels didn't have enough regular viewers to rely on on-channel advertisements. Getting the word out and bringing new viewers to the channel would require considerable marketing spending, and I've already established that budgets were a challenge. As a result of these challenges, channels moved first into producing original movies. Many had considerable budgets, $2 to $5 million, but the risk of producing a movie that failed was much lower than the sunk costs of series development. Importantly, the movies often drew larger than usual audiences, and the channels found that advertisers were willing to spend considerably more to advertise during these films, which encouraged experimenting with original series production. The downside to original movies was that they provided only a one-time benefit. They brought an audience on one night and incurred a significant marketing cost to do so. A successful series could return an audience over multiple weeks without high levels of ongoing marketing. Unsurprisingly, the first original series were not clear successes. Several are now long forgotten or were never noticed. Initially, ad-supported channels tended to make shows similar to those on broadcast networks, but typically on a lower budget. These low-budget imitators failed to draw audiences' attention or ascribe relevance to the channels in the way hoped. The most significant inroads were made by co-produced shows. USA and CBS co-produced a male-female detective crime-fighting series that still suffered from many of the low-budget imitator weaknesses, but co-production provided a series with the budget necessary to create a show that stood out and earned some notice. You know Pacific Blue and Silk Stockings? Wow. To pull the story together at a conceptual level, understanding why cable channels didn't produce original series earlier can be understood as the power of a paradigm. I'm using paradigm here in a Kuhnian sense to reference both established practices and ways of thinking. A broadcast paradigm prevailed at this time. Everything that was known of television, everything thought inherent to television, had been developed because of what television could be when distributed via broadcast technologies. Myriad practices that might seem wholly unnatural from a context outside the US were difficult to perceive as arbitrary or resultant from particular cultural, economic, and technological conditions. But it wasn't just industrial and audience practices that composed the broadcast paradigm. It also drew power from how both groups thought of and understood television. Matters such as budget thwarted change, but so too did lack of imagination. It was a lack of imagination that allowed the initial low-budget imitators. Rather than attempting to redefine the nature of a television series, the first impulse was to reproduce the known. Importantly, the paradigm governed both the thinking of those in the television industry and audiences that had only known broadcasters and their practices as the source of original programming. The pervasiveness of the broadcast paradigm and the extent to which it seemed definitive of the medium of television made the development of original scripted cable series difficult. To explain how it finally happened, we delve into a case study. The story of the creation of La Femme Nikita for USA reveals the incredible hurdles encountered when violating the paradigm of a creative industry. The story is longer and even more nuanced than I'll present, but here are some key parts. The series is based on the 1991 French film. When it was released, a television executive at Gaumont, the company that produced the film, was struck with the sense that it would make a good television series. When she inquired about the rights, she learned that they had been included with the remake rights that had been sold to Warner Brothers. Warner remade the film as Point of No Return. It didn't really want the TV rights, but they'd just been thrown in. This began a multi-year process of trying to convince Warner Brothers of the property's potential as a series, which involved trying to find a network or channel interested in a series based on the film. The second time the Gaumont executive brought the idea to USA, the channel had a new executive team in place that realized the coming competitive shifts, understood the value of original series, and happened to love the film. A long and complicated process of developing the series ensued. First, executives higher in the company demanded that the writers find a way to make the lead character, a cop killer that becomes an assassin, more sympathetic, as they worried about advertiser support for the project. Next, they had to find an actress capable of the complexity of the role, again, a sympathetic assassin, who would work on television and for a cable series. The casting of Australian Peter Wilson was notable. Wilson sought to pivot from modeling to acting and perhaps did not appreciate the lack of cultural capital of cable shows at the time. With a script and talent in place, budget reemerged as a challenge. The way that U.S. television series are financed, especially in the 1990s, is called deficit financing. The broadcast networks would pay 60 to 70% of the cost of making a show, and the studio would finance the rest, the deficit, in the hopes of recouping that deficit by selling the show internationally or for a second and third window in the U.S. This was a familiar and well-established process for broadcast networks, but as an original series for a cable channel, a relatively unprecedented venture, it was unclear what practice should prevail. Warner Brothers, again the studio with the rights to the series, would not produce Nikita at a deficit. Arguably with fair reason, the studio was doubtful of the possibility of selling a show produced originally for a cable channel in any other market, and USA couldn't afford the full cost. This is why previous series had appeared as low-budget imitators. Cable channels often had to fund the full cost of production. The producers then cobbled together a co-production deal for the series with partners in Germany, France, and Canada. The deal granted the partners distribution in their territory, though they were not directly involved in the production. Notably, even with the co-production help, the series was produced for roughly $900,000 per episode, compared to the $1.5 million that was typical for an hour-long U.S. drama at the time. Despite all these practice-related struggles, perhaps by chance, USA happened upon a series that hinted toward a strategy that would be beneficial for cable channels, that of distinction. If you don't know La Femme Nikita, it is probably most comparable to Alias, which was groundbreaking, but 4 years later. Nikita differed significantly from broadcast conventions of the time. Per the Alias comparison, it was characteristic of the action spy genre that has since yielded series such as 24 and The Americans, but in terms of the television landscape in which it appeared, it was most like a modern version of the action-driven Highlander or Xena Warrior Princess. Beyond genre, it had an uncommonly dark tone. Again, such darkness becomes common throughout the early 2000s, but it lacked comparison at the time. Finally, the series featured a female protagonist. This, too, was a representational trend about to take off. When Nikita debuted, there was Xena and a detective series called The Profiler, but the rest of the female-centered dramas that I wrote about earlier in my career, Buffy, Ally McBeal, Sex and the City, etc., that proved very successful and come to make female-centered series common, had not yet appeared. So even though La Femme Nikita is relatively constrained in comparison with the series that follow, it is characteristic of all the ways the content of US television subsequently changes in its complexity, characters, and form. That La Femme Nikita embodies a strategy of distinction isn't all that clear as it airs. It doesn't become a cultural phenomenon or a New York Times darling, and it was only through some investigation that its role as the start to the story of the changing relations between broadcast and cable becomes evident. 2 months after La Femme Nikita premiered, HBO debuted the prison drama Oz, and distinction surfaces more clearly as a strategy. As a subscriber-funded service, HBO was particularly incentivized to produce distinctive programming. Before Oz, HBO had produced some comedy series and had established a reputation for top-rate original films that had already demonstrated what came to be known as the HBO brand by producing films that weren't as commercial as those made for theatrical distribution, but also much edgier than what was likely to be produced for ad-supported television. Importantly, a key motivation for shifting into producing original series was HBO's acknowledgement that emphasizing specials, films, and sports in its programming eschewed the opportunity of a regular schedule. HBO conducted research that found a cause of canceling the service was a sense of not finding anything on that derived from its lack of regular programming. Merely instituting a practice of debuting a new theatrical film every Saturday increased subscribers' sense of value from the service. So HBO sought its first drama to build regularity. The story of how Oz came to be that first drama is as idiosyncratic as the others. HBO's head of programming mentioned to a colleague that the documentaries about prison life it aired were popular. This colleague knew that Tom Fontana, producing Homicide: Life on the Street for NBC at the time, was interested in creating a series about what happened in prison, but the subject material seemed impossible for a US ad-supported network. As sometimes happens, Fontana was soon pitching the idea to HBO execs. And as never happens, HBO gave him $1 million to put his idea on film. Fontana returned with a 20-minute pilot demonstrating the tone and look of the series, and the HBO execs felt certain it would meet their goal of offering something that would stand out. If you aren't familiar with Oz, it's not an exaggeration to say that it broke nearly every rule of US television. The character perceived as the protagonist was killed at the end of the first episode. It broke the fourth wall, allowing a character to speak directly to the audience, and it populated an entire series with unlikable characters. Of course, all things that become commonplace in the subsequent decade, but not yet the case. Even these formal innovations don't address its unflinching, yet also not exploitative, examination of all manner of sex, violence, and language never previously aired on US television, and most of which would be exceptional on film as well. Oz's development experience was much different from La Femme Nikita's, due largely to the difference between the situation of being a subscriber rather than advertiser-funded channel. USA was trying to establish a brand identity for the channel on the back of Nikita, but at the same time needed to attract a large enough audience to earn the advertising revenue needed. HBO wanted to add value to existing subscribers and attract new ones, and for its programs to draw a lot of attention, such as press coverage, even if not that many watched. In what proved to be very fortuitous, the studio producing Oz went bankrupt a few seasons into the series, necessitating that Fontana find a new studio, and HBO took on production itself. This inaugurates HBO's model of self-ownership of series that becomes tremendously, underlined, big words, tremendously, important 13 years later. Owning the majority of its original series enabled HBO to launch the richly populated HBO Go and the HBO Now streaming services. And this is a matter for another talk, but because studios own shows and vigilantly manage their intellectual property, professional content otherwise came quite slowly to legal internet distribution. With Oz, HBO also established a comparatively hands-off approach to creative talent. This followed from the series' uncommon creation process. Normally, a creator would first submit a script, and the network would offer notes and suggested changes before producing a pilot. By all accounts, Fontana was afforded the ability to follow his creative impulse without intervention from the channel's executives. All of the case studies in this project, other than Nikita, have unusual creation stories or writing situations that suggest conditions that encourage their uncommon, distinctive content, which I'll address in just a minute. Success, such as that of HBO and its pursuit of distinctive original series, may seem obvious in hindsight, but it is important to acknowledge that HBO had no reason to be confident of Oz's success. Its most recent original comedy before producing Oz, one that had the pedigree of an HBO success. It's shot in black and white with a distinctive visual style. It was based on absurdist humor by an established filmmaker, and it was a series that had fallen out of development at mainstream broadcaster CBS, had failed miserably, despite similarly meeting the criteria of standing out, and by many measures seemed a quintessential HBO success. But Oz did succeed in drawing enough attention to support the channel's strategy of pivoting into original series production. Many know the subsequent story. In the next 5 years, HBO launched Sex and the City, The Sopranos, Curb Your Enthusiasm, 6 Feet Under, and The Wire. All were not only distinctive from broadcast, but from each other as well. These series led to a reconsideration of American television storytelling, but it is unclear whether the accomplishments HBO achieved were tied to being a subscriber-funded service, or whether such a strategy could be viable for advertiser-supported cable as well. To offer a quick trajectory of next steps, in 2002, ad-supported cable develops its next successful series that are notably very different from each other, yet distinctive from broadcast norms: The Shield by FX and Monk by USA. Gradually, other cable channels likewise find successful strategies, and original scripted cable series grow plentiful. Mad Men's debut in 2007 marks another notable milestone as the first ad-supported show that draws the level of critical accolades only previously achieved by subscriber-funded services, thus in many ways proving ad-supported cable could be as creatively and artistically rich as subscriber-funded series. With Mad Men 2, the cultural discount of cable is eradicated, and cable comes to be seen as legitimate a form as television as broadcast. The next important milestone emerges from a trifecta of series: Sons of Anarchy on FX, Rizzoli and Isles on TNT, but most notably, The Walking Dead on AMC. Although many earlier series may have seemed from afar like they were massive hits and required viewing among the American populace, in fact, most averaged only 2 or 3 million viewers in a country of 115 million television homes. And notably, Mad Men often didn't even draw 2 million. The accomplishment of this next milestone was to achieve a cable mass hit. Indeed, mass hits remain far from what they used to be, but these series drew more than 10 million 18 to 49-year-olds. And for The Walking Dead, that made it the most watched series among cable or broadcast, among that advertiser-coveted demographic in a given week. Following that accomplishment, the milestones become difficult to identify. Game of Thrones is arguably one, and its accomplishment is something like becoming the first global blockbuster. Due to a combination of textual features and HBO's uncommon status as a distributor that owns its series and also owns distribution outlets around the world, in its 4th season, Game of Thrones became the first series simultaneously released globally. That such a thing could happen is notable and suggests how extensively industry norms might be further disrupted, but it is doubtful that this will be a harbinger of a new norm. The final entry in this story of what happened to U.S. television emerged as unexpectedly as the others during the first months of this year, after comedian Louis C.K. forwarded this message to fans by email and on his website. Horace and Pete, a 10-episode, single-season series, was funded, produced, written, and distributed by CK. Although digital distribution had made previously unimaginable amateur and independent projects possible for the last decade, CK's experiment marked something different, at least in the US context. It remains too soon to know the consequences, but the implications of talent being able to produce a series of this quality and sophistication independent of the US television industry could be profound. A lot of attention has been paid to US drama production of the early 21st century, both within the US and as many of these series have found audiences around the globe. Though many do great work analyzing the series, identifying the narrative techniques, storytelling conventions, and other textual features that explain the widespread fascination, such understandings are made richer with a knowledge of how such accomplishments came to be. If I were to explain my research agenda, which might seem disparately split between textual studies of gender and television industry studies, I'd explain that my core curiosity relates to understanding how changes in industrial practices change textual possibilities. The longer work that this study of Nikita, Oz, and the others are part of investigates the first decade of the 21st century to explain how stories so different from US television's past emerged, thrived, and became the standard bearers of US television. The simple answer is a shift in competitive environment, though that does little to address the manifold challenges particularly evident in La Femme Nikita's development struggle, nor does it explain how challenges related to defying a paradigm at the time were overcome. In Nikita's case and several others, creative champions played a particular role. The persistence and tenacity of the Gaumont executive who pursued Nikita's development was extraordinary. Not unprecedented, it reminded me considerably of the story behind the launch of Survivor in the US, another show that redefined television norms. In that case, it was a junior executive at CBS that kept supporting the series and pushing the idea until Mark Burnett packaged the concept in a way CBS would have been foolish to refuse. Creative champions can be innovative creators, unwilling to give up an idea everyone tells them will never succeed, and they can be found in executive offices, willing to steer into apparent change instead of retrenching. Another repeated story is of entrepreneurial creatives. In creative industries, we often expect risks from established talents who have earned enough to not need to work. But in the stories here, innovation derived from young and unknown creatives willing to take a chance on cable when most of those working in television wouldn't even deign to consider it. Whether Andy Breckman of Monk and those who followed him to produce shows for USA, or Sean Ryan at FX, the cable revolution derived from unestablished talent taking a chance on a most uncertain opportunity. Jackie DeCrinis, who was a programming executive at USA in the early 1990s, explained the challenge that cable faced. Cable couldn't afford the creatives that were accustomed to broadcast pay scales. And at the same time, the lowly cultural capital of cable made some trying to break into the industry wary that a first job in cable might limit future opportunities. Cable's startup-like conditions provided a boot camp in all facets of television production, not the narrowly defined roles of the broadcast paradigm. In many cases, those who took the chance leapfrogged past their peers. Returning to creative conditions, it wasn't just Fontana at HBO who was afforded uncommon latitude. The scale of programming innovation also derived from early cases of not trying to make television. Sean Ryan wasn't realistically thinking about selling the Shield as he wrote the pilot, and that lack of self-censorship of what can be done on television was crucial to the series' boundary-defying elements. Andy Breckman, the co-creator and executive producer of Monk, had never written a television series and hired a room of writers similarly unqualified. Matthew Weiner wrote the pilot of Mad Men not because he intended to immediately pitch it to channels, but to have a writing sample that would help him be perceived as more than a comedy writer. These circumstances explain how distinct series emerged. Finally, there is a fair bit of chance in this story, the serendipity unrealized in the moment and later revealed. Monk probably never would have been developed if it weren't for the golden parachute provided to a man named David Hoberman when Disney decided to shut down Hollywood Pictures. Part of his severance included production commitments, and these commitments allowed Hoberman and Breckman to circumvent the typical pitching process and commence development with a single sheet of paper explaining their concept for the series that became Monk. Though Monk is in many ways much less distinctive than other series considered here, its distinction from the norm by featuring an abrasive, obsessive-compulsive character as its focus might have otherwise led it to be quickly discounted. Monk was twice blessed by chance that an executive initially involved in its development by ABC, DeCrinnis, found herself in a new job at USA after ABC had shelved development when they couldn't find an actor that could quite pull off the role. Similarly serendipitous, The Shield would never have existed without executives at Fox TV, a division that's tasked with comedy development, choosing to share a script that Sean Ryan had written to get past the writer's block that was preventing him from writing the comedy that they'd contracted him for, to executives at its conglomerate sibling division of FX. It seems inevitable that Ryan would have contained some of the innovation of his lead character, Vic Mackey, as anti-hero, if seriously pursuing The Shield as a project at a time when only HBO had produced a series with such a premise. These factors and conditions that enabled Milestone series to come into the world and adjust thinking about television also led to shifts in practice that were then perceived to correspond with the series' success. A significant component of understanding the difference of series produced for cable channels is appreciating the difference in the terms of their creative work. The grueling nature of broadcasts' 22-episode seasons and its negative consequences for creativity were well known before cable produced original series, but no way out of this system could be imagined, given the structure of reward developed for U.S. television's commercial norms. In order to establish themselves and attract top creative talent, cable channels were willing to try different norms. Some early cable series produced the standard 22 episodes, but following HBO's consistent success with 13-episode seasons in the late 1990s, these shorter seasons increasingly became the cable standard. Importantly, though most have focused on the creative benefit of shorter seasons and the broader array of talent that can be attracted, as have I in other writing, a less considered consequence is the greater precarity introduced. The salaries of those producing half as many episodes are likewise halved, and lining up a second job to compensate can be difficult to time if it is even permitted in contracts. Moreover, established guild and union rates for cable are lower than broadcast, so such jobs come at financial cost in multiple ways. For instance, just looking at the Writers Guild minimums, writing a 60-minute story in teleplay warrants earnings of $36,000 if it is for one of the big four broadcast networks, but only $25,000 for cable and other small networks, so 70% of the broadcast rate. That gulf widens if rerun and residual payments are factored in. That same episode on a broadcast network, rerun, earns $23,000, but only $4,300 on cable. Residuals on portals, internet distributed services such as Netflix, are even more complicated and quite a bit lower because they aren't tied to actual airing of an episode. Nevertheless, the predominant discourse has been the siren song of creative freedom available when working in cable. And the emergence of original series developed for internet distributed portals has added a new chapter in this story. As entities such as Netflix, Hulu, and Amazon that curate a library of content rather than populate a schedule, contract original series, they are employing different strategies than those that have traditionally dominated the business. Strategies related to the difference of selling a library rather than a schedule. Rather than norms of windowed content in which a show is created for a network and then sold for re-airing by a cable channel and in markets around the world, These entities seek to control exclusive access in perpetuity, especially companies such as Netflix that have vast global reach. The perception that working in television is exceptionally lucrative derives from the structure of residual payments. Those who became rich did so because of receiving payment for content as it played again and again, year after year, around the world. Creatives working on internet originals encounter different deals. Because the services want perpetual and global rights, they do not engage in deficit financing. There would be no way to recoup the deficit if the rights are tied up by that original licensor. In this case, too, the discourse has been about creative opportunity, or the extraordinariness of Netflix spending $100 million on 26 episodes of House of Cards. Though Netflix didn't receive full rights for its first series, those figures aren't as rich if the lack of opportunity for residual earnings is considered. To pull things to a close then, I've offered a look at why U.S. television changed in the early 21st century and how early scripted cable dramas were able to disrupt and arguably expand the broadcast paradigm. Let me trace out some implications to explain where things stand now. The original cable series developed because of a need to stand out and establish distinction in the marketplace. But by 2010, notably, a point even before Netflix, Amazon, and others became an important part of a story about television, this strategy started to fail. There had grown to be such an abundance of distinction that it no longer was noteworthy for a cable channel to develop an original series, and it became increasingly difficult to stand out. A few have succeeded in this task. Although I suspect most all have heard of Game of Thrones, I doubt many have heard of Horace and Pete, although I encourage you to check it out. By 2010, the mandate for the competitive environment shifted from developing distinct programs to ones that are noisy. Clearly an indication that the marketplace for viewer attention had evolved from abundance to surplus. Networks, channels, and portals seek programs that are loud and can generate attention to allow them to stand out in this surplus. It remains early days for noisy, but high-profile deals for top talent, often those who have not worked on television, are noisy. So too are successful deployments of well-known IP. It is probably too soon to know whether noisy is viable, whether any program can be predicted to produce the volume necessary to stand out in a context in which viewers have unprecedented choice in how, when, and where they watch. Noisy also speaks to the need for programs that provoke a cacophony from viewers who talk, tweet, and post to help series produced in an era many critics have dubbed peak TV be found. Just as this story began with a changing competitive environment that begat a new strategy, 20 years later, we have arrived back at a similar moment. Instead of a new abundance of competition, we have an abundant abundance of competition and an industry sorting out the disruption of the affordances of internet-distributed television, particularly its lack of the linear requirement of a schedule that produced many of the protocols of television production and use to date. Just as the conditions that led to distinction can be mined for insight into how change comes about in a creative industry and is resisted, so too will the transitions part of this evolution be full of lessons about how changing industrial norms allow for and encourage adjustments in creative products and the conditions for those making them. Maybe I can return in 2036 to sort them out. Thank you.